Something pretty interesting is starting to build around this team, and honestly, it feels like one of those storylines fans are going to be talking about a lot once camp gets rolling. There is a young player who still has a lot to prove, but the upside is real, the expectations are high, and if everything comes together, this defense could look completely different. So let's talk about why this could be a much bigger deal than some people realize. If you are hyped for the season, hit that like button and drop a SKOL in the comments. The most important Vikings story right now may not be about a veteran, a quarterback battle, or even the big names already expected to carry this team. It may be about a rookie who has not even practiced yet in purple and gold, but who could completely change the ceiling of Brian Flores' defense if everything breaks the right way. Caleb Banks is the name Vikings fans need to be watching closely, because according to ESPN's Kevin Seifert, there is a real belief inside the building that Banks can be ready when training camp opens in just a couple of weeks. That matters more than people may realize. This is not a depth piece. This is not some late-round developmental swing. The Vikings spent the 18th overall pick in the 2026 NFL Draft on Caleb Banks, and when a team uses a top 20 pick on a defensive tackle, that player is not being brought in just to rotate, learn slowly, and maybe contribute later. He is being brought in because the organization believes he can become a difference maker, the kind of interior force that changes the way an entire defense functions. But here is where the story gets interesting. Banks did not get a normal offseason. He was not out there fully participating in practices. He was recovering from surgery to repair a broken fourth metatarsal bone in his left foot, an injury he suffered at the NFL Combine back in February. That is the kind of detail that immediately makes fans nervous, and understandably so. A rookie defensive tackle missing practice time before his first NFL season is not nothing. He needs reps. He needs timing. He needs to adjust to the speed, strength, and demands of the league. But Kevin Seifert reported that the Vikings did not rush him, and that may end up being the most important part of this entire update. Instead of pushing Banks too early, Minnesota allowed him to observe most practices on the field. That still matters. He was around the team, around the coaches, watching the defensive installation, absorbing the rhythm of the program, and staying connected instead of being completely removed from the process. Then, by the end of spring, he was working on the rehabilitation field with other players who were sitting out. And then came the key line. Head coach Kevin O'Connell said he believes Banks will be ready for the start of training camp. For Vikings fans, that is big-time news. If Caleb Banks is close to full strength when camp opens, Minnesota gets to begin the real evaluation immediately. They get to see how he looks against NFL offensive linemen. They get to see how he handles Brian Flores' system. They get to see whether the traits that made him a first-round pick translate quickly. And most importantly, they get to see whether the concern around his health begins to fade or whether it stays attached to his rookie season. Because make no mistake, the risk with Caleb Banks is real. The transcript makes that clear. This pick was viewed by some as controversial, not necessarily because people questioned the talent, but because health was already part of the conversation. The broken foot at the Combine was not the only injury concern attached to him. There was also mention of a lengthy list of injuries from his time at Florida over the last couple of seasons. That is why this training camp update feels so important. The talent is exciting, but availability is going to decide how quickly the Vikings can actually benefit from it. And when you look at the physical profile, it is easy to understand why Minnesota made the swing. Banks has a 7'1" wingspan, described as the longest for any defensive tackle since 1999. That is a rare trait. That is not something teams can teach. That kind of length can affect throwing lanes, disrupt blocking angles, help him control gaps, and make life uncomfortable for offensive linemen trying to win leverage inside. As a run defender, the belief is that he has a high floor. That means even early, even while he is still growing as a pass rusher, he could help Minnesota hold up in the trenches. But the real question, and maybe the one that determines how special this defense can become, is whether Banks brings pass rush juice right away. That is the part that can take this from a good rookie addition to a major defensive upgrade. The Vikings did not draft him in the first round just because he can occupy space. They drafted him because of what he could become: a do-it-all defensive tackle who can stop the run and still collapse the pocket. That is exactly what Brian Flores wants from his defensive tackles. Yes, Flores is known for those aggressive, chaotic, hellfire blitz packages. That is the bread and butter. But imagine what happens if the Vikings do not always need to bring extra pressure. Imagine what this defense becomes if Flores trusts 4 rushers to create heat without sacrificing coverage behind it. That is when a very good defense can start flirting with something even bigger. And that is why Caleb Banks is one of the most fascinating players on this roster heading into camp. If he is healthy, if he is ready, and if he can flash early, the Vikings may have something that changes their entire defensive identity. But what do you think, Vikings fans? Are you buying the Caleb Banks hype already? Or do you need to see him healthy on the field first? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this one could become one of the biggest storylines of training camp. And this is where the bigger picture starts to come into focus. Caleb Banks is not walking into an empty defensive tackle room. The Vikings already have some intriguing pieces up front, and that makes his arrival even more important because he does not have to be the only answer immediately. Levi Drake Rodriguez was described as a player people around the NFL may still not fully recognize, but someone who was really solid for Minnesota this past season. Then there is Dominique Orange, also called Big Citrus, another name in that defensive tackle group. There is also Tylik Ingram-Dawkins, with the question still being whether he plays more on the edge or inside at defensive tackle. But the name that really stands out in this group is Jalen Redmond. The way this was framed, Redmond is viewed as one of the most underrated players, not just on the Vikings' defensive line, but in the entire NFL. He is described as a do-it-all type of defensive tackle, strong against the run, and capable of giving the defense more than just early down toughness. And when you pair that kind of player with Caleb Banks, you start to understand what Minnesota may be trying to build for the future. The Vikings may be banking on Jalen Redmond and Caleb Banks as their 2-star defensive tackles going forward. That is a huge statement, but it also fits what Flores wants. He needs interior defenders who can handle the run, but he also needs players who can create pressure. If Banks becomes that type of player, the Vikings defense can go from really good, maybe even close to great, into a unit with a chance to become something far more dangerous. And then there is the offensive line conversation, which may be just as important for the Vikings' overall ceiling. Warren Sharp released his yearly offensive line rankings, and he had Minnesota at number 12 in the NFL. That feels like a fair spot, based on what was said. There are questions, especially at center, but there is also a lot to like. Christian Darrisaw and Brian O'Neill give the Vikings confidence at tackle, while Blake Brandel impressed in the second half of the season at center. At 6'7", playing center at that level is not easy, but he held up well and moved well. The real X factor may be Christian Darrisaw. If he is healthy and back to being one of the top left tackles in football, this line changes completely. Add in Donovan Jackson potentially breaking out in year 2, and suddenly the left side of the Vikings' offensive line could become one of the strongest in the league. That is how a number 12 unit can climb into the top 6 or 7. And if that happens, there are no excuses for Kevin O'Connell and this offense. Jordan Mason was described as more than serviceable, maybe even a top 12 running back this year, and with this offensive line, the Vikings should be aiming for a top 10 run game. So now the question goes to you, Vikings fans. Are you more excited about Caleb Banks possibly changing the defense, or the offensive line giving this offense a new identity? Drop your take in the comments, hit the like button if you believe this team is building something serious, and subscribe for more Vikings updates.